there's anything you want me to leave out.
No.
It's good.
I mean, if you want to skip the middle part where I was.
It's impressive. It really is. It is. I'm so glad that you're in Birmingham. Thank you. Hi. Oh, sir. Good to meet you.
Are we marching in with a parade? Or do you have a band?
No, I'm introducing Tina, and she's introducing you.
Yes.
Let's separate.
Auf jeden Fall. Ich bin immer sehr ganz gerne schon für sehr gut. Ich bin auch sehr zufrieden. Es ist gut, so viele Leute hier zu sehen.
Ja, es ist toll. It's a great turnout. Wow.
Ja, good turnout. Nein, ich wollte nur sagen, ich kann wahrscheinlich nicht die ganze Zeit bleiben.
Okay.
Good evening. Good evening. Can y'all hear me? I don't have a very good voice. Panelists, if I could have you go ahead and come sit up here for the evening, actually. Panelists. We've got a full house, so that helps with some chairs. Anybody needs seats? We've got a few up here on the front row. Squeeze in, get to know each other. We've got a couple over to stage left. I think I said that right. All right, thank you. And I'm not going to take up too much more of your time. Just a reminder for any of our teachers that are here and have not signed in over at the volunteer desk, please make sure to do so. You will get CEU credits for attending this event. We also have Scantrons up there that you will have to fill out for your evaluation in order to get credit. So make sure to find me at the volunteer desk after the program.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Thomas Bryant, Executive Director of the Birmingham Holocaust Education Center. Absolutely delighted to be here. I want to welcome you all on this beautiful fall evening. A couple of housekeeping items, or one housekeeping item. Please be sure to silence your cell phone. This is going to be a very enlightening panel discussion, and one I think we will all find very timely. Tonight's program, How Germany Has Come to Terms with Its Past. Please allow me to recognize and thank our partners who have made this program possible, our host, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute and Director Ms. Andrea Taylor, the American Council on Germany and Mr. Rob Fenstermacher, the UAB Institute for Human Rights and Dr. Tina Kempen-Reuter, and our special guest, Mr. Stefon Schluter, a former German diplomat who has allowed us to host him and expand his conversation through this exciting partnership. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, Dr. Tina Kempen-Reuter. Dr. Reuter is the director of the Institute for Human Rights and associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration and the Department of Anthropology at UAB, specializing in human rights, peace studies, and international politics. Her research focuses on human rights with a particular emphasis on the struggle of vulnerable and marginalized populations, including minorities, persons with disabilities, refugees and migrants, women, children, the LGBTQ community, and people dealing with the consequences of poverty. She is also an expert on ethnic conflict and peacemaking with a geographical focus on Europe and the Middle East. Before joining UAB, Dr. Reuter was director of the Reif Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution and associate professor of international and comparative politics at the Christopher Newport University. She was formerly associated with the Solomon Asch Center for the Study of Ethno-Political Conflict at the University of Pennsylvania, the Institute of Public International Law at the University of Zurich, and the Center for Security Studies at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. Dr. Kempen-Reuter holds a PhD in International Relations and International Law and an MA in Contemporary History, Economics, and International Law from the University of Zurich. She is the author of numerous publications in her field and has been awarded multiple prizes and grants to expand her research and teaching. Birmingham is very fortunate to have her. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Tina Kempen-Reuter. Thank
All right, good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to be the moderator tonight for this incredibly important topic. I also get to introduce our incredible panelists. Thank you to Thomas for the nice introduction. So I'm just going to start on your left side, okay, with Gregory Wilson. He is a history instructor with more than 40 years of teaching experience. He has taught teaching in multicultural society and African American studies at UAB. He is currently an adjunct instructor at Lawson State Community College, where he enjoys creating classroom film presentations and innovative instructional strategies that promote deliberative pedagogy via national issues forums, while motivating and engaging students to appreciate the study of history using relevant and different perspectives. Welcome. Next to him, we have Laura Anderson. Laura is the Director of Operations at the Alabama Humanities Foundation, where she has spent the last 2 years, among other projects, traveling the state of Alabama on behalf of Making Alabama, a traveling exhibit marking the occasion of the 200 years of statehood. Before that, she worked 14 years as an archivist at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, where she focused on patron services and connecting scholars to the general public to the small but rich collection held here at the BCRI. She's also an accomplished author and editor of books and articles on public history and civil rights. Welcome. Next to her is Kiara Boone. She's the Deputy Director of Community Education at the Equal Justice Initiative. Kiara works with Equal Justice Initiative's racial justice projects, which are aimed at changing the narrative about race in America through educational reports, videos, short films, and 2 new cultural spaces, the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, dedicated to Black victims of racial terror lynching in America. If you haven't seen them, I strongly encourage you to go. Finally, we have our special guest for tonight, Stefon Schluter. Stefon Schluter has been engaged with the Jewish community for many years and strongly believes that German diplomats have an obligation to reach out to Jewish communities due to the legacy of the Holocaust. He joined the German Foreign Service in 1979 and was sent, among other places, to Buenos Aires, Algiers, and to Tel Aviv, and multiple locations in the United States. During his time in the diplomatic service, Mr. Schluter engaged in dialogue with Jewish organizations and synagogues about Germany's relationship with the Jewish people and organized several trips to Germany for rabbis. In the summer of 2017, he left German Foreign Service and currently serves as a program director at the German Foreign Office Diplomatic Academy in Berlin. Welcome, Stefon Schluter. We're going to start tonight with a presentation by our special guest, followed by a short in-panel discussion before we open up for Q&A and discussion and input by the audience. All right.
This is wonderful. Well, thank you very much for this introduction, and thanks for the possibility to participate in this absolutely incredible event. It's standing room only, so this is great. Coping with your own dark parts of the history and keeping the memory alive and teaching the following generations, applying lessons learned, that is definitely no easy feat. It's also a work in progress, actually. So the heading today, how Germany has come to terms with its past, is perhaps a little bit premature and optimistic. So I think this is a work in progress, and we definitely have to go on. This never stops. And I don't know if I can tell you too much about that, or at least there will be a two-way street and not a one-way street, because this morning I was in Montgomery. I went to the Legacy Museum and to the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, and boy, that was really moving, and what has been done there is absolutely remarkable. So I think perhaps you should come to Germany once in a while and next time and tell us how to do these things. It was really, really remarkable and moving. So I'm not quite sure that I can add so much to what has to be done in that respect, but let me just outline for 10 minutes or so what we have done and how it came about, where we are now, and how it started. In the beginning, in 1945, there was silence in Germany. It was the end of the Second World War. It was the end of Shoah. It was the liberation of the concentration camps. Germans set about to rebuild their society, rebuild their cities that were mostly destroyed, and the ex-Nazis. They were still in the administration, they were in the judiciary, they were also in the schools as teachers. You couldn't just get them out totally. They were in public life and in high-ranking positions in government also. The Allies also were not really interested to teach Germans what happened. Actually, right after the war, during the liberation of the camps, the British as well as the Americans, they shot lots of films and they prepared a documentary, which was about 90 minutes long, and you might have seen snippets. I mean, what is known about the liberation. You saw these emaciated prisoners shuffling about. You saw these stacks of corpses being bulldozed in mass graves, and those were just a minute here, a minute there, and there has been prepared a documentary of 90 minutes, stomach-turning, heart-wrenching about this, much worse than what you have seen. And this was done to show the Germans what has been done by them and in their name. And then this documentary was shelved. It was not shown. Because in 1946 then, with the upcoming Cold War and the friction with the Soviet Union, the Americans as well as the British decided, no, we don't want to antagonize the Germans. We want to have them on our side, so let this be the past, let this be bygone. And in Germany, nobody really had an interest to dig into the past. What they said was, yes, there were atrocities. This is what happens in war. And too bad, really bad. We're sorry, but that was it. War crimes, which happened before or which will happen afterwards, and that was it. Now, this all changed in the early 1960s when Israel abducted Eichmann from Argentina. And the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem got lots of publicity. And then shortly afterwards, a very brave prosecutor in Frankfurt, in Hessen, Fritz Bauer, he started to dig into the atrocities at Auschwitz, and he prepared the Auschwitz trials. And some of you might have seen a film on his endeavors, which was called here Labyrinth of Lies. It's a very good film, very well done, but the title is a little bit misleading because the German original is Labyrinth des Schweigens, Labyrinth of Silence. And that's what it was. Nobody talked about that, and they only slowly started to talk about that. But then with the Auschwitz trials, when the facts about the concentration camps and the whole system were laid open, especially the young people were shocked. And the trials actually also were one of the catalysts of the so-called youth revolt of 1968. Another milestone was 10 years later was, strangely enough, it was the miniseries Holocaust, a soap opera. But for weeks and weeks and weeks, you put a face to the 6 million, which was something that totally changed the equation. And I just mentioned this today when I was in Montgomery to my guide and said, do you think that that could be compared, that the Roots here, when Roots was shown here, that somehow had the same effect? It put a face to the horrible, horrible tragedy of slavery. And she said, yes, that's probably, yeah, it's a very good parallel. So I think there's a parallel between our two countries. Now, since the 1960s, students learned about our past in school. I went to school from 1958 to 1969, and I was very, very well aware of what happened. And there was always the criticism that not enough hours were spent on teaching about the Holocaust, teaching about the Third Reich, teaching about how it came about. And yes, I mean, you can't spend half a year or so only talking about that. So what you do, of course, you just start, you have your lessons in school, but then especially in Germany, our past, the Shoah, the Third Reich, is always present. Wherever you go, you have it either on TV, you have newspaper articles, you have the so-called stumblestones, the Stolpersteine, which you see, and we might perhaps talk a little bit later about the significance of monuments, like, for instance, the Stolperstein, or also the monument in Berlin, as well as the monument here in Montgomery. So there is a presence there, and you don't need to talk all the time in school about it. And classes also go to former concentration camps, to memorials. I was just last week, on Tuesday, I was in Hamburg, near Hamburg, in a concentration camp, Neuengamme, and accompanied 15-year-old students from Bonn who came there and did a 3-hour tour through this concentration camp. And it was very interesting. And I talked also to the teachers, and they told me, well, this is pretty difficult. It's a subject that it's very emotional, and The students, depends of course on their age. If they are 10 or 15 or 18, they react differently towards what they are being taught. But they told me, well, in universities, when we had our training, nobody ever told us how we should teach this to the kids. So what we are doing now, and we have a new federal commissioner for the fight against anti-Semitism, and he told me also, he said, what's really important is to teach the teachers how to teach. And that's one of the things that I think is the same here in the States, because everybody approaches this from a different point of view. And some react with hate, some with shame, some with shock. And interestingly enough, a recent survey found that, especially with girls, that they afterwards, when they were asked, are you a proud German, are you proud to be a German? They said, not so much anymore. So they're less proud to be a German. And this, I think, is very good. So obviously, it shows that these teachings, they have some result. And because they react the same way as we reacted. We grew up born in 1952, without any sense of nationalism. Because, I mean, how could you be, with that history, with that burden, how could you be proud to be a German? You can be proud about certain achievements, as I'm proud, for instance, about the way we deal with our past, which is something that you don't find very often in other countries. But being proud to be a German, no. And I think this is also something that might then lead also in this whole discussion on populism. This is the next thing, because this is a very nationalistic notion that unfortunately on both sides of the Atlantic has gripped societies. So this is something we can perhaps discuss later. Just as a nutshell, I just want to say, what our goal was actually in teaching our past. That is, to describe it, it's from collective shame to collective responsibility. Because one shouldn't only be ashamed, but you should do something with the information and try to do your part to better the world and society. So I think this is just a little introduction, and I think we've got lots of other things then to discuss with the panel. Thank you very much.
Ich werde stehen. Ja, schon gut. Vielen Dank. Well, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I think there's lots to talk about, and we thought long and hard about what the focus should be of tonight's panel. But the idea really is to talk about, well, how do we talk about the past? Just as Mr. Schluter just discussed, who owns the past, and how do we come to terms? Like, what does it mean for us today? So I want to start this panel off with maybe sort of going a little bit deeper on the teaching questions, and ask the other panelists to talk about this too. I read recently that people are forgetting about the Holocaust. People are forgetting about the civil rights movement. Here in the United States, people are definitely not talking about the killing of indigenous populations. What do we do about this? Are there mandates that require teaching the Holocaust in Germany, or teaching the civil rights movement, or slavery, the Jim Crow South in the United States? And if there are no mandates, are these atrocities discussed in schools and other educational institutions? How do we talk about this in our schools and our educational environments? I think I'm going to start with Gregory.
Thank you. My name is Gregory Wilson, and in the process of getting students involved in the study of history, we looked at it from the perspective of teaching or telling difficult stories. And in that process, I began to set up displays. With those displays, actually, we started with Eli Wiesel, book Night, which was a book that quite a few students had read in school. From that, a few years ago, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, along with the Birmingham Public Library, had a display on Anne Frank. When that display was dismantled, I saw the potential of getting the actual display. So I have that as a part of my collection, and whenever we get into World History 122, discussing World War II, I really like to get into the Holocaust, and as a part of my time here at the Civil Rights Institute, we carried students to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It was a tremendous experience to get the students to go behind the scenes. They can see the displays, but to go into the archives and see the actual preservation of these items. So I got the idea of collecting artifacts from that period of history. We also got a tremendous collection of books, and one of the things that the Holocaust Museum put out was how to teach the Holocaust. So I used that as a template to expose my students to this history.
Thank you. Should we just go in here?
Well, I've never been an educator in the sense of being in the classroom, and so working here at the Civil Rights Institute and also with the State Humanities Foundation, I suppose I'm considered an educator by many because I'm involved in making available, or in some cases creating, materials that educate people about the civil rights movement in the U.S. South primarily. I have to say I have some sort of natural aversion to understanding standards because the process by which we create those standards as a state or a government just doesn't sit well with me, and so I don't understand too much about our standards. I have a 10-year-old, and he is a 5th grader in a Birmingham city school, and so that's my experience with what is being taught or not taught in a public school in Alabama right now. We have a lot of work to do.
Good evening. I think as someone who also is not an educator in a formal sense of leading a classroom in a K through 12 or even a higher education setting, but what I have had a chance to get insight in is to when we have opportunities to connect with students, whether they be middle school, high school, or even at the collegiate or professional level. And one of the things that becomes really clear are the gaps in information, as well as a lack of nuance around these issues. And one of the things that we try to do at EJI is to bridge those gaps and to fill in those voids by providing a comprehensive understanding of our nation's history and taking it a step further to be able to understand how that connects on a global scale. And so how does what's happened in our nation connect with what's happened in other places as well? And one of the things that we found to be very effective tools in trying to begin that journey or to continue that work is the use of narrative storytelling. So the point about putting a face to the brutality of these situations. When people have an opportunity to understand the stories of people, when they can resonate with them, it makes it easier. And what we also try to do is a point that I think my co-panelists have brought up is to provide resources and materials that make it easier for educators to be able to do so. The area that is challenging to navigate is the standards and the mandates. One of the things that our history has taught us is that you can't just change the laws. You also have to be able to convince people with their hearts and minds, the convictions, for us to be able to engage in this conversation. Because what we don't want to happen is for it to be a mandated history that is still very flawed, still very one-sided, and still very wrong. And so what we're trying to do is make a comprehensive understanding of our nation's history and the continuum and the ways in which it still manifests itself today so that we understand that history is still still relevant, it's still living. We're still dealing with the legacies of this past. And those are some of the tactics and strategies that we try to engage in, not as necessarily educators, but as people who understand the power of understanding this history and the ways in which it can be used to inform advocacy or anything else.
Well, in Germany, we have a very decentralized system, so every federal state has its own cultural ministry, and they do the curriculums and everything. But of course, there's on every side there is an effort to really give a good education and to be very committed. And we have the young teachers and also older teachers who are doing a very, very good job. They have school books, they have other teaching materials. There are lots of institutions in Germany who are helping them with that. I've seen some of them, and they're very good. And they're changing now also a little bit, like these teachers, for instance, in Neuengamme at the concentration camp told me that they're trying now to use also another angle with our rightist movement, with the Alternative for Germany coming up. They're trying to stress a little bit more, how did the Nazis come to power, what was the situation at that time, to say, beware the beginnings. So be very careful how slowly one comes on a slippery slope and goes into that. For instance, at one moment, the guide in the concentration camp said, and lots of the SS people, there were people who already, as young ones before Hitler even came to power, they were followers of Hitler and his ideas. And afterwards, I asked her, did you mention this? We were just to warn them to perhaps already getting too close to the Alternative for Germany now. And she said yes. This is one of the things, that very slowly, she tries to introduce that. So I think the teachers are doing a very, very good job. They only have like about 7 hours for that, for the Third Reich and the Holocaust. But this will be supplemented always with like these visits to the concentration camps, with movies they're watching, and as I mentioned before, with the ever-presence of the Shoah and the Third Reich also in our public life.
Thank you. I see this in my own classroom sometimes as well, like how do we talk about this? And one of the things that I find useful, and I know all of you have mentioned this in one way or another, and I'd like to dig a little bit deeper. It seems like tangible items and emotion are important to relate the past. Would you talk a little bit more about the importance of memorials in education of children, but then also in educating the public? Like I know you mentioned the Stolpersteine in Berlin and elsewhere, the lynching museum and those kinds of things, and obviously looking where we are tonight, the Civil Rights Institute.
Shall I start and then we go back? So it's okay. So yes, these monuments, they are very important. Also, what's also very important is to hear from people who survived that. So, and we are very grateful that an astonishingly high number of survivors of German Jews, year after year, come to Germany. They are now in their late 70s, 80s, sometimes early 90s. They go to schools, they talk to the students and tell them what it was like. So I think this personal testimony is something that unfortunately, for biological reasons, we will not have that very, very much longer, but this is an incredible help. Other than that, the monuments are important, but not the monuments alone. They should always be accompanied, at least in my view, with some information. So I don't know if anybody of you had been to Berlin to see the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. It is very impressive, but for me, the big difference has been done by the information center that is downstairs. You go downstairs, and this is a very well-prepared center that gives you a very good impression and also strives to put faces on the numbers. So they show the fate of different families from Greece, from France, from Poland, from Russia, from Denmark, and how they lived before the war and how they got caught up in the Shoah and how some of them survived and some of them perished. So this is one of the the monuments to the Information Center, which I think is worthwhile. Then again, with the monuments, I mean, this is yours in Montgomery. It's practically as big as ours, and but I wouldn't say size doesn't matter. There are some ideas with your monument here, with, for instance, then giving some of that to the counties involved. And then actually you are establishing a monument all over the states. I think this is a stroke of genius to have this idea. This is absolutely great. And size, well, as I said, doesn't matter. I don't know if anybody here has been in Yad Vashem. I think the most moving memorial is the Children's Memorial in Yad Vashem, which is just a room, lots of mirrors and candles and somebody reciting names. I get goosebumps when I talk about this. This is the most touching memorial, so size really doesn't matter. But I think in Berlin as well as here, I think we've done a remarkable work there.
So when we at EJI decided to embark on the journey of opening the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, it wasn't an effort to make this information, this argument that slavery never ended in America, it simply evolved, something that will be accessible to a larger population of our nation, but also the world. We understood that we still have a long way to go in our classrooms and around our dinner tables, but we wanted to provide these physical spaces where people come and have an honest reflection about this history. And the Legacy Museum, to speak about size, is relatively small. It's 11,000 square feet, but it's very dense. And what we try to do in that space is to make this argument about these four eras, one that we're currently living in, a mass incarceration, but to do so in a way that connects with people in terms of the proximity to the situation. So we talk a great deal about the domestic slave trade and anchoring people in an understanding of that as a foundation of our local narrative in this nation, in this region, but also in Montgomery. And then using that to show the evolution into the second era of racial terrorism, where we've documented over 4,000 African Americans who were lynched throughout our nation, a great number of them in the Deep South, but something that is very much a shared history throughout our country. And that evolving into the Jim Crow segregation era, a history that is outlined beautifully here in this very museum, but one in which, as a law firm, we are talking about the way in which systems of oppression have been allowed to be perpetuated, and we show how Supreme Court cases have been outlining that, and that draws a huge parallel to the conversations that we're having now about our courts and about our Congress and about how those things actually matter for generations. And then that leads us into this current era of mass incarceration, and we use the letters from people who are incarcerated, who have written to us over the years for assistance, who talk about their cases and their experiences in prison. And then we have a visitor's booth where you can sit down and actually listen to these narratives, because we think it's really important that we're uplifting these stories. But it offers an opportunity to really disrupt the silence and disrupt the dissonance that we are often so easily able to create between ourselves and some of these issues, but also showing that continuum, that this history is very much relevant to the challenges that we're facing today. And at the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, we take that same argument about the history of slavery to mass incarceration. And although the memorial focuses on the history of lynching, you still see that narrative thread. One of the first things that you encounter is a sculpture done by a Ghanaian artist that depicts the transatlantic slave trade, because you can't understand the brutality of racial terror lynching and how we as a country could allow that to happen if you don't understand the dehumanization that happened during slavery. And because we know so little, or we've talked so little except outside of academia about lynching, we have a lot of contextual information as you enter the site, because we want people to be properly oriented and understand the context before they enter this very symbolic place that does very much shed light to the memorial in Berlin. And when you enter that site, you encounter over 800 monuments that represent the counties, the independent cities, the parishes where we've documented these racial terror lynchings throughout the nation. And they have the names of the victims that we've been able to document. And one of the things that we have to stress is that these are the names that we were able to research and uncover. These are the names that we know. we understand that there are many more that exist only in oral history or that have been lost. But this is just to show the tip of the iceberg. And as you enter this space, the physical experience of the memorial is also really important in terms of how it confines you in that space, how it forces you to engage with that history. And then you have an opportunity to read some short reasons why people were lynched. Everything from social transgressions, drinking out of the wrong water fountain, shocking white women, registering to vote, being black. And then you encounter this wall of remembrance of a water exhibit. And we all know the power of water when it comes to reflection and thinking. And then that wall is dedicated to the names that we don't know. And when you exit, you see the Monument Park. And that is where we are inviting communities across the nation to work together to build and form these coalitions to claim, to retrieve their memorial monument from the memorial. So each monument has a duplicate. And this is a part of our larger community remembrance project where we are hoping to disrupt the silence around this history through education, through soil collections where we collect soil from the sites of these lynchings, where we're erecting traditional historical markers, trying to disrupt the dominant narratives that exist in so many places, trying to change the iconography of our country, because what we memorialize and the things that tell those stories speak volumes about what we value as a society. And if we take a look at our nation now, if we take a look at what's in front of our courthouses, what's on public land, then that's what is reflected in our values. And we have to read the inscriptions and we have to read the installation dates to understand why those monuments, why those memorials matter. And so for us, this is an effort to change the narrative. It's a very ambitious mandate, but it's something that we feel very strongly if we're going to get to the healing, the reform, and the solutions that we so desperately need as a community.
You all are doing a superb job of changing the narrative and changing the idea of what is a monument, because growing up in the South and living in the South, the word monument just means you look at something and you learn about the time and place it was built and the people who built it. You don't learn any actual history. And we were watching Andy Griffith the other night with my son, and that episode where everybody in town they need a memorial to a person so they can have a hero. And, you learn about the process of mythologizing history. And so I'm kind of down on monuments, but the examples that we're talking about tonight are exceptions to that feeling that I have. What attracted me to working here so long ago was the fact that this is an institute, and the founders were very clear about wanting it to be a place for research and conversation. And yes, there is a museum, and there's a story that's told, there's a narrative, and it's quite detailed. One criticism that I have heard of civil rights movement education in Alabama is that it is way too full of detail and too sparse when it comes to teaching tactics and teaching about the opposition to the movement. Those are areas that we really need to work on.
Thank you. My approach is somewhat different. The monuments are absolutely great. We try our best to get our students involved by using little techniques. One I utilize is called film and history. And the reference to the movies, we have a whole list of movies that we bring and share with the students. The other idea is to utilize comics. Are you familiar with Mouse? Absolutely. Art Spill, what's the guy's name?
No, it was a huge discussion. Should one use comics like
Yes,
that?
yes. It is so fascinating, and the comic book actually comes with a teacher's manual, and it's titled "My Father Bleeds History." And just to read through that, it really breaks the wall of, this starchy academic, and you'll find more students acclimating toward a comic, yet they're getting a tremendous amount of history as they are reading. The other approach that we utilize is oral histories. And we're saying, how in the world can we connect with EJI, the Jefferson County Memorial Project, of which we're getting our students involved in. And I will be presenting on tomorrow, so I asked Ms. Boone here for permission to use a clip of her film. I'm not a filmmaker, but I have an iMac, computer, iMovie, and it is incredible that I can create a movie right in front of the students, and I can narrate, and they are incentivized because the students say, I can do that. And then we give them a topic. And I would like to introduce to the group here today a young lady that I met by chance. I was at another institution in the archives. She was working in the library. Her name is Miss Betty Sanders. I would just like for Miss Betty Sanders, because I brought her into my school classroom, and she has agreed to come back. Miss Sanders, would you stand and turn toward the audience and introduce yourself, please? There she is in front of you. Absolutely. So let's give her a hand, please. Suddenly, the history class came alive. They saw a face, a person, a primary source. The book is one thing, but when they can hear and see, and I feel that that is a fabulous opportunity. The second aspect of that, with the EJI project, the Jefferson County Memorial Project, getting my students involved, we found two individuals. One works on the campus, has never told her story. She's the director of public relations, but in talking, I got her to talk. A member of her family was lynched. And Ms. Boone here know my other cohort who shared the same story. So one of the things I attempt to do is to bring people who are connected to the story, connected to the histories, and I would like to share, there should be another gentleman in the room that's connected with the Jewish community. Is his name Yusuf? I'm not really sure if he's here, but I invited him here to come out and share, because we're going to invite him to the classroom as a Jewish ancestry person. And if anyone here who would like to engage and walking into the classroom, please let me know, because this is the way to really get our students involved. There's a lady here who, shared with me concerning the Jewish cemeteries. Unbelievable. The Hebrew writing, to get a person. And the other individual showed us her stamp on her arm. Tattoo. And that is a tearjerker, to see the person still here. And that group of people are gradually passing off of the scene. So I feel to really get students involved, you have to step outside of the textbook. You have to step outside of the standards. Can you imagine teaching an 8-week course and I have to share all of this information? I'm telling you, digital technology, using film and history, you can put a lot in a short period of time. Thank you.
If I just may add something to that.
Yes.
Use the digital also. That's I remember.
That's right.
Steven Spielberg
Yes.
in the early 1990s, he started with the Shoah Foundation,
Yes.
a document. He has, I don't know how many thousand testimonies of survivors.
Absolutely.
And that is it's a treasure. It's an absolute treasure. And it's very difficult because when I talked about the silence after the war, that the perpetrators didn't talk about what they did, interestingly enough, on the victim side, it was the same thing. Victims didn't talk about that.
Absolutely, yes.
I had once, when I was stationed in Los Angeles, I had to call a lady because she was a witness in some court proceedings for somebody who wanted to have a pension, and he came from Romania. This is too long. Anyway, I went to her house, and she ignored it. She said, "Okay, fine. If it takes 20 minutes, then it's fine. So you get what I have to say about that. But 20 minutes, is that?" "Yes," I said, 20 minutes. We sat there for 3 hours. And at one point, she said to me, "Oh God, I'm sitting here with a German diplomat, and I'm telling you things I'd never told my children."
Amazing.
So there was
Yes,
lots of silence on both sides, actually. But once the silence is broken, and what they reveal, this is a treasure that we surely could make use for the future generations.
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, I would like to make sure, I would hope everyone here knows about the BCRI Oral History Project. It's the largest collection within the archives, and when I worked here at least, it was the most often requested material. And it is the entry point, particularly because they were videotaped, over 350 interviews with people who were active in the movement, either as children or adults. But when I used to talk about the process of doing those interviews or identifying interviewees, even if I was not going to be doing the interview, which was often not appropriate for me to be doing, I referenced a book called The Grace of Silence, which Michelle Norris wrote, and it was out so many years ago now, but I still find it really useful because she was trying to explore why people don't tell their stories to their children and how and to prevail upon people to do so before it's too late. So.
I want to build on what you just said, and I want to ask the panel one more question before we open up for general discussion. It seems like there's different ways we can tell our stories. It seems like there's also maybe the problem, or I'm not sure if it actually is a problem, that there's different truths, that people responsible for committing the atrocities and victims have very different perceptions, talk about history differently. And so I want to ask the panel, who owns history? How do we speak about the past? Does it matter that different portions of the population might have different points of view? And what does this mean today as we continue to confront anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant, and racist voices?
Start over there.
Well, I posed that question because I didn't want to answer it.
Well, then you shouldn't have brought it. I thought it was
It's
good.
what I thought about most every day when I worked here, and I still think about it in my work now. That's just giving resources to other people who want to tell stories. It does matter very much. What are you going to say, Greg?
One of my approaches is to use also art. And the way we can do that, we can juxtapose two periods of time, okay? And we can bring them together. I got this idea from, if you remember Judy Chicago. She did a fabulous book on the Holocaust. It was called The Holocaust Project, From Darkness into Light. And she took slavery and juxtaposed it with Nazism. And where the sign at Auschwitz says, work make you free, she really asked that question from an African-American perspective. And I had the opportunity several years ago, I think it was while I was here at the Institute, we had an artist to come through, Mr. McDowell, very well known, and I could not pay him for what he did for me. Just talking to him, I asked him to put these images together. And as we were talking, he was drawing. So I actually have those actual art pieces, drawings, in which I share them with my students so we can create a display. And just by looking at several of these pictures, juxtaposing a slave and a Nazi, even when it came down to hangings, the lynching situations. But most incredible, he also suggests looking at a quilt and having someone to create a quilt that will embellish the aspects of these stories. I'm not sure if all of you really realize the stories that are embedded in quilts. I grew up with my grandparents, and they were quilters. And we started to realize how much is in the fabric of the quilts. It was incredible. And sometimes they stitched dates, they stitched names. And to bring one of those, and I actually have 2 of these quilts, and I just hang them up in the classroom. And everybody has an affinity for something that they are familiar with and that they can relate to. And it starts the conversation. Oh, and now they began to appreciate the past. So in terms of who owns the past, we all belong to the past. We are a continuum of the past. And at the same time, it is our duty to project this information into the future by creating these actual historic artifacts that are around us. And we all have those within our possessions, but just recognizing the value of what we have.
When I saw the question about who owns history, who gets to tell the story, I thought about power dynamics, and I thought about who's in control and who maintains the dominant narrative. And you think about that parable you hear about the lion and the prey, and if you hear the story from the mouth of the lion, it's a very different story than if you hear it from the mouth of the prey. But it also made me think about an experience I had when I was in 3rd grade, and one that I've been thinking more about since I've been working at EJI in this capacity. So I grew up in a small town in northeast Mississippi, and in 3rd grade we went on a field trip to the local public library. I think they were trying to teach kids how to use the library as a resource, learn, all that good stuff. And our library happened to be a former jail, and it was right next door to the courthouse. And the librarian was walking this group of 25 black 3rd grader, 8-year-olds, through the museum, and through the library, and she was showing us the old jail cells and the gallows and how they had preserved the jail, but now used it as a library and had all the books and things in it. And then on the 2nd floor, she looked out the window and she showed us the courthouse, and then she showed us a tree that was beside the courthouse, and she said, that's where they hanged bad people. You all don't need to grow up to be bad people like the ones they hang. And at that time, we were all just like, oh, that's scary, ghost stories. But as I've been thinking about it more and more, history is embedded in our values, and it's embedded in how we think about each other and how we think about our systems and our policies. And so when we talk about the value of understanding the legacy of slavery and understanding the legacy of racial terror lynching and Jim Crow segregation and how it is actively manifesting itself today, it is an understanding of the devastation of that narrative. So one of the things that you'll hear, if you've had a chance to hear Brian Stevenson, our director and founder, say, is that one of the great brutalities of slavery wasn't just the inhumane conditions and actually being property, but it was this narrative of racial difference, this myth of racial difference that was created. And if our histories aren't told in a way that encompasses the experiences of all parties, of those who are oppressed, then we we risk perpetuating those same mistakes. And we've seen that cycle over and over again. And so it is important that we interrupt that cycle. It is important that we engage in actual truth-telling. And that's what at EJI we're trying to do. And we are a legal organization, so we see it through the lens of the criminal justice system. But there's also these connections in education, in healthcare, and wealth disparities. And until we understand the comprehensive nature of that, we will still be in the same hamster circle having these same conversations. And how we learn from the past is in creating space for that truth-telling. How we engage not only young people but adults is engaging in spaces that allow for that honest reflection. And not to keep quoting Bryant, but another thing that he says that I think is so true and it resonates so deeply is that we're not in this work of truth-telling to try to find blame and to force punishment. We're doing this to liberate us all. Because we've tried this manner of either ignoring it, being silent, sweeping it under the rug, and we find ourselves in these same situations. And so let's just try something different. Let's see what happens. And that's what we're trying to do. So if you haven't been to the Legacy Museum or the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, if you haven't read some of our materials, if you haven't engaged with us, please do so. Consider this your special invitation. When you come, tell them I sent you.
Well, who owns history? This is very difficult, and you've got different, you would have different historians, and the interpretation of history is one of the things, you know, that keeps many people busy. And I think who owns it? There is some truth and not truth, and unfortunately history repeats itself, and but mankind doesn't learn from history, though history repeats itself. So that's a huge problem. There's, for us in Germany, we have a very, very clear-cut view. For instance, with regard to Holocaust denial, with us there is no First Amendment. With us there is a clear no. This is against the law, and you don't deny the Holocaust. And this was one of the things, for instance, I remember in 2000, 2001, our justice minister conferred with John Ashcroft, the justice minister at that time under Bush. And they tried to find common ways to fight against Holocaust deniers. And all the propositions that our justice minister brought up, he said, First Amendment with us, no way, you know, we can't help you there, or we can't join you in this actually necessary fight. But I mean, it's not just that you want to teach history or learn lessons of history. I think this is just the instrument to instill values in the kids. And they have to learn from what happened, and hopefully they come away with certain responsibilities and values that will help fight off any repetition and again, history repeats itself. But there I think we have to start, and this is the most important thing in my view.
Thank you. Yeah, I would agree that, you know, it's extremely important that we always remember whose voice is missing. Who are we not hearing, and how can we make sure that those who don't have a voice have agency to tell their stories through whatever means is possible. Only if we do that, then we're complete as a society and are able to confront maybe some of the threats that we see to tolerance and diversity today. All right, we want to open up. We have about 25 minutes for questions. You want them to line up? You can start.
I'm sorry, Ms. Odessa.
We're talking about teaching and teachers and students learning. I just discovered this wonderful book called by Nora Krug, K-R-U-G. It's called Belonging. Kathy, you would love reading that. It's graphic and all of that. I don't mean that you need to read cartoons, but I just mean it's graphic. So, but here's the thing. Here is a story of a person who is searching for her family's involvement in Germany. What did you do? during the Nazi regime. And it's told in such a wonderful way that I would recommend this to everybody. I do not get a commission for recommending this, but this I would suggest all ages, called Belonging.
As a graphic novel.
Krug. Her name is Nora, Nora Krug. Thank you. Belonging.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi.
We'll just stay
My name is Robbie Ballard. I teach at a small independent school here, and the discussion about who owns history it took me back a year and a half ago. I visited Dachau, and one of the things that I saw was SS housing, the SS guard housing, was being used by Syrian refugees. And initially I was quite horrified by that. And then I thought, what better way to give the middle finger to those SS Nazis than let a bunch of refugees live in their old houses, you know? What better way? And I was thinking kind of the same thing about the jail, to an extent, you know? What better way to use a jail than to turn this into a house of knowledge now? What better way to repurpose this than to turn it into a house of knowledge? So I wanted to make that statement, but then I have a question. So I spend a good bit of time discussing convict leased labor and discussing the Holocaust in my classes. And one of the things, I teach middle school, 5th and 6th grade. And in our Holocaust discussion, they never see a dead body, because my goal is not to shock them. To what extent do you think our civil rights education is too focused on shock, seeing the pictures of the fire hoses, seeing the pictures of the dogs, something that we definitely need to be aware of and something that we definitely need to know happened? But to what extent do you think that our civil rights education focuses too much on shock and awe and too little on here are the root causes of this, here's the basis of this? Thank you.
Well, actually, that's a great question, simply because when we look into the methodology provided by the Holocaust Museum, we don't want to show the shock and awe aspect, but look at the systematic causes that led to those turbulent periods of our history. And the same thing with the Holocaust. You know, it didn't just happen, it was over a period of time. And another connection that we were able to make showing this, because when we do civil rights, when we're into civil rights, most people look at Dr. Martin Luther King and his, mentor, we're going to use the term mentor here, Mohandas Gandhi. However, when you dig into the depths of the research, you will discover that Mohandas Gandhi actually made an appeal to Adolf Hitler. And he wrote a letter titled, "My Friend Hitler." So, the story has to be presented, and you're possibly wondering, how did I get that bit of information? Talking to a student from India. These students bring a different perspective to the story. And that's why I welcome, my multiculturalism. And the gentleman ended up going back to India. When he returned, brought me material that I would not have been able to obtain anywhere else. So I'm one of the few people who actually have books about that, but also I own a copy of Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. So when I put that type of material out, students can see a person has done the research. When it comes to the civil rights movement, I just talked with one of our foot soldiers this morning because I'm putting her on my schedule. She was a 15-year-old girl living right here, and you know the name, you know the person, absolutely. and to share her story. Her picture is in this room, and it's quite fascinating. So I am really interested also, not so much in doing the shock and awe aspect, but to look back, because when this student shares, young lady now, shares her story, she was not prepared for what she experienced in 1963 on the streets of Birmingham, and that's a part of her narrative. She shares that. So it was an awakening for her, and it's not so much as we putting out shock and awe, but these people are still with us, and they are still bearing the trauma of that experience, because when they went through the dogs and all of this, there were no psychologists out there to mend their emotional damages. So they want to tell their story because they're carrying something really deep within them. And I never had those experiences, but the point is, you know, I won't deny her for sharing her actual experiences, because some people said, you know, the dog didn't bite the guy. Well, we found the guy, and the guy said, yes, the dog did bite me.
I appreciate your question. I guess my concern is that so much of what's offered in mainstream educational materials is too celebratory. I don't think that these images that people have seen over and over and over are a counterweight to that, though. I think people are inured to those images now. And so that's why I say we have so much work to do, because we need to complicate the story, and we do need to focus on tactics. If you use those images, you use them to illustrate a tactic of the movement or a tool that the movement ended up being able to adopt to change public opinion. I'm not really answering your question. I just appreciate it, and I can't imagine as an educator what I would choose to do, but it sounds like you're doing a good job.
I also appreciate your question, and it's one that we weighed when we were curating the Legacy Museum, particularly when we're talking about images of lynchings. And one of the things for the lynching images, you can opt into seeing more of the graphic ones, because there is a utility in showing the way in which those images were used. But there's also an emotional toll. And so what we've decided to do in the main exhibit area is we have some of those images, but we focus on the crowd. We focus on the people who were carrying out the atrocity, because that's another thing. We often use passive language when we're talking about the civil rights movement, like we just had segregation by accident, as opposed to it being something that was being perpetuated and carried out. And so we just came out with a report at EJI called Segregation and America. And in that report, we have a who's who in white supremacy. And we also have it online, and there's a website. And so there are tools to use to sort of counter the images that by the 5th grade, a lot of your students probably have seen at least once in some capacity, to show that there were elected officials, there were police officers, there were people in positions of power who were actually carrying out these things, who were resistant to the protesters.
Dr. Schluter, thank you very much for being here. And thank you for your remarks. Two things resonated with me particularly. You suggested, I think, that it's sometimes hard to be a German. And you suggested, I think, collective shame leads to collective responsibility. I want to ask my students about that. So I ask you, where does the understanding needed to do better in the future come from? Does it come from the students? Does it come from the churches and the synagogues? Does it come from institutes like this? Does it come from teachers? Does it come from our leadership? Thank you.
Well, the leadership, is it on? Not really? Now it's better, okay. Well, it should come from everybody. It should come from everybody, and when I mentioned this survey that said that especially girls said they're not as proud to be Germans anymore, I think this is, if this could be taken away as a result of if you teach about the dark spots of your history, that if kids come away with the notion that no, right or wrong, my country is not right. That I think is very, very important. If you see all the national symbols, I'm very wary of those national symbols. And so life or death behind the flag, whatever. So I mean, this is absolutely horrible. And you can't love your country. I love my wife. I love my kids. I don't love my country. No, so and I think this is one of the things. If kids come away with that as a first result of being taught of what your country did that perhaps was not so great, I think that's already a great feat.
Just next time, just
Is it possible, because you said that the silence after the war, after the concentration camps were already released of everything, is it possible that the silence of the kids and the people in that generation, are they now able to embrace what has happened, or do they still not know about it in the education of the young people? They're learning, but what about the people that didn't have the opportunity because of the silence? Where are they?
Well, when I talked about the silence, this was in the 50s and 60s. For part of I went to school in the 60s, and I very well learned about our past and history, but many perhaps did not. But this was now 60, 70 years ago. So I think now everybody should know about it, though a recent survey also found out that about 20% of youngsters in Germany didn't really know what Auschwitz was.
Right.
So I mean, this is an ignorance, but you'll find this ignorance. Ask a young kid in Germany now who's the Bundeskanzler, who's the chancellor, or who's the foreign minister, and you probably also would have 20% who simply don't know, because they know about their music and they know about this or that or their games, but all the rest, it's not interesting to them. So even in Israel, they once asked kids who was Sadat, and they said, Sadat, wasn't he somebody who was working with Hitler? And so, you know, absolutely strange notions of history, and they just don't get it right. You always have this certain percentage of ignorance.
I guess the main thing is that people that are teaching or have taught the younger kids, if they were from the silent era, would that have made a difference in their teaching?
No, well, on the way, then I think everybody learned. And if they went to university afterwards, whatever that's at the least, then they learned.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here tonight. I think this has been a great program. I'm really appreciative of your time. I want to ask this question, starting off kind of with the caveat that I realize that I'm speaking from a place of privilege, so I want to put that out there first. But when we have discussions like this where we're talking about minority populations, whether it's Jewish people and others in the Holocaust or people of color when it comes to civil rights or any kind of minority group, for those of us who are not in the minority and who have, you know, family history of people that perpetrated these crimes, or who may still have friends and family who are racist or any number of things. Where is our fine line with the responsibility to be on the forefront of speaking out against these things and participating in justice and equality for everyone, while at the same time realizing that we do have a privileged voice and that the voice of those who are experiencing that discrimination is much more important than ours? So kind of how do we balance that, and while also recognizing that, you know, we don't also want to put a burden on the people who are being victimized and discriminated against in addition to what they're already experiencing. So I know that's kind of multifaceted, but any thoughts you have on that would be appreciated.
One of the things that we instituted, I'm actually acclimating my students in the direction of holding public forums. And we are connected with the Kettering Foundation in Dayton, Ohio, in which we have national issues, and we frame those national issues. And it's open to everyone, and we use what is called deliberative pedagogy, deliberative dialogue. There's no right or wrong answer. Everyone has an equal opportunity to share their opinion, and in that process, we find a greater number of people take part and participate. And we really also planning to do the same thing with the Jefferson County Memorial Project with the Equal Justice Initiative to bring that style, that format to the community where the college is located and hold a community engagement type of response. And the level of privilege is quite fascinating in that everybody sees history from a different perspective, and we talk about historiography and all of that. But yet a forum is open, and there's no us and them type of thing. So I would suggest holding public forums based on the National Issues Forum, Kettering Foundation, we're going to push them now, okay? Dayton, Ohio, they have the forums, they have everything to get your community engaged in a national issue.
And I would just add to that, that one of the things that I stress to groups who we have the opportunity with meeting with at EJI is that we're always so thankful that someone decided to come and talk to us and who was interested in having an open mind and an open heart to our argument. And as someone who's wrestling with these issues and who's learning yourself, you have an opportunity to enter spaces that I won't be invited into. You have an opportunity to build on the relationships that you already exist because they're familial or friendship-based, or you just shop at the same grocery store. And that's an opportunity to capitalize off the privilege that you have in those spaces to share what you're learning. So to the extent that you want to be doing justice and walking in your truth, it's navigating the spaces that you already operate into, because you will have access to spaces that are limited to those voices of color that you're talking about, but it is an opportunity to introduce them, to elevate them, but using your personal spaces to do that work.
If I may, I'm not on the panel, but if I may, because this is sort of my daily business in a lot of ways as the director of the Institute for Human Rights at UAB, I do a lot of advocacy work for groups that I'm not a part of. And what I've learned, like the way to be a good ally, right, is two things. One, listening is extremely important. I think not many of us are good at that. And so to really try to listen and not, jump in with advice or, your own ideas. You can bring them in, obviously, at one point, absolutely. And the other thing is, sort of maybe going off of what Kiara said, use your privilege to elevate the voices of those who don't have agency. Like, when I'm in my work, what I'm trying to do is to have those people present to speak. Like when we have a panel on, let's say, the rights of transgender people, I want the voice of someone who is transgender to be represented on the panel. It's not about, and I think that's a good way to say, a good way to use what you call your privilege to confront injustice. Thank you.
I've had the privilege to work for several years in Uganda, and one of the historical legacies that I've had to confront and that I think is still dealt with quite a bit, especially at a diplomatic level, is the legacy of colonialism, and specifically with German colonialism. hopefully it's common knowledge by now that from 1904 to 1908, there was a genocide committed by the German Empire against the Herero and Nama tribes, where about 80% of the Herero people perished and about 50% of the Nama perished. And this was recognized as an atrocity by the German government in 2004, but not recognized as a genocide until 2015. And there are still negotiations going on between the German government and mostly the government of Namibia, although representatives from the Herero and Nama tribes would prefer that they negotiate directly with the tribes, which kind of comes to this question again of who controls the narrative of history and who do we talk to about this. So I'm particularly interested in your opinion as a diplomat of how Germany can approach this issue of confronting its colonial history, and then also how can it take the lessons that it's learned from addressing its history of the Holocaust to also teach its population about its colonial history and to spread that knowledge among Germans. Thank you.
Well, I think it is it is being taught in German schools also. Our colonial we came pretty late into the as a colonial power in like the late 1900s. And there were other European nations who, well, for centuries, they had their colonies. And so we actually were in Namibia, we had Uganda, we had some Togo, and some very, very small spots. And I think we are also doing a fairly good job to see to it and to remedy what happened at that time. It's a lengthy process, but we are actually doing that.
All right, let's give our panel a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you all for a wonderful discussion. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again for all the sponsors and the hosts for a great event. We hope to see you next time. We're discussing important topics. Have a good night.
Thank you.